Welcome to the Rare Books Department. The philosophy behind the Rare Books Department has long emphasized the importance of the book as a physical object. Some of the most meaningful interactions with the Rare Books collection have occurred in the classroom, where students are able to hold history in their hands. We would now like to extend our reach in order to remain committed to providing reference, research, and educational access by offering new online options for students, faculty, and community members alike. We welcome you to subscribe to the official Rare Books blog, Open Book, and browse our digital exhibitions. Click on the links for more info and enjoy.
Close your eyes. Think of a book and imagine holding it in your hands. Consider its weight. Consider its shape. And maybe even its smell. Now open it. What do you see? Most people, when thinking of a book, first envision a rectangular shape. This shape is made up of a stack of papers which are bound on one end and encased between covers, sometimes hard, sometimes soft. We are comfortable with this image of a book. It has over time come to refer to a single object. That object is called the codex, and it has endured for more than 2,000 years as the device for the dissemination of ideas. But have you ever considered what a book is or how it came to be? Have you ever wondered why it looks the way it does, or what will happen to the book once we've all plugged into the digital world? It may seem simple, but defining the book is no easy task. In order to do so, we must trace the origins of its physical form, its readership, and its content. Once we see where the book has been, we'll be able to get a better idea of where the book is going.
The story of the book starts approximately 4,500 years ago in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. At this point in time, the book took on the form of a clay tablet. Such clay tablets might conjure up images of Moses bearing the Ten Commandments on two large stone slabs. But in reality, most clay tablets were far more modest, typically small enough to fit into the palm of a scribe's hand. Not far from where the Sumerians had used clay, Egyptians were investigating resources from their own river. The papyrus plant grew exclusively along the Nile and was used so extensively in ancient Egypt it was nearly eradicated. The papyrus scroll influenced not only the codex form, but also the digital reading devices we are so familiar with today. Papyrus scrolls allowed continuous writing and reading on surfaces that could be 30, maybe 40 feet long, providing us with the verb we use to express how we move text that extends beyond the screen's boundaries. We scroll. Unlike the clay tablets, papyrus was light, easy to transport, and easy to store. It's a wonder that clay tablets didn't immediately become obsolete. The truth is, these two writing supports coexisted for some 2,000 years.
Initially, the form of the book evolved based on the abundance of natural resources in any given location. Like clay and papyrus of ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt, elsewhere in the world, the structure of the book was adhering to the needs of its users. In Peru, the earliest form of record keeping was done with knots. The quipu was a device that consisted of a main cord of cotton or wool with pendant strings attached to it. The pendants could include even more strings dyed in a variety of different colors, which, like the knots, hold special meaning. In China, the plant considered to be the most abundant was bamboo. Bamboo was a versatile material which could be used in architecture, agriculture, and the arts. It's not surprising then that bamboo was also the material used for the earliest book form, known as jianzi. Jianzi scrolls were used for distributing all kinds of information in China, including funeral lists, divinations, and civic records, in addition to medical texts, philosophy, and literature. Before long, a cheaper, more lightweight material was needed. Using a mashup of hemp, mulberry bark, fishing nets, and rags, paper was born. The paper was introduced by Kai Lun to the Han imperial court in 105 CE. It was ultimately through Islamic Spain that Europe would receive paper in the 12th century, at which point the codex had become the dominant book structure. But meanwhile, in Mexico, the Mayans and the Aztecs were using fibers from the fig tree to make their own kind of paper. These sheets could be attached on the sides to create long accordion folds with intricate designs. Prior to paper, however, parchment was long the popular support. Developed around 1600 BC, parchment provided a durable and portable alternative to papyrus. Unlike papyrus, which could only be harvested along the Nile River, parchment could be made anywhere there was enough land to raise cattle, goats, and sheep. Sometimes deer, squirrel, and other wild animals were used to make the material. Parchment could be folded, cut, wrapped with leather, and then sewn along the side, creating what is considered to be some of the earliest codex examples. The codex was the form of the manuscript tradition, and it continues to be the quintessential exemplar of the book as we know it today. This is the side-bound book, portable, durable, economical, easy to reference. You don't have to have both hands to use it. You can read it standing up, you can read it sitting down. But as adaptable as the book is, it wasn't always this way. In fact, the evolution of the book took centuries and depended heavily on the content within its pages and the ever-increasing informational needs of society. The Codex first gained popularity through the rise of Christianity and in the form of monastic manuscripts. Monasteries had a monopoly on the production of books, and each was equipped with its own scriptorium and library. Religious texts in ancient Greek and Roman works were copied and recopied into large, hefty, illuminated manuscripts that often took dozens of people and decades to complete. But why? Why were books so big? You see, the shape and style of these early books had a lot to do with the reading practices of the day. Unlike the silent private reading we now take for granted, reading back then was an oral practice, a performance even, one that was reflected in the writing itself. If you pay close attention, the text was often written in a continuous script, without changes in case and with minimal punctuation, if any. Reading instead relied on things such as repetition, meter, rhyme, and image as mnemonic aids to the performer, the reader. The admiration of illuminated manuscripts heightened the book's popularity, especially among the aristocracy. Smaller manuscripts were commissioned by members of the laity, making worship, and thus reading, a private act. This put value and status on the codex as an object. A Book of Hours is one such book of private devotion. The Turin-Milan Book of Hours has had a long and complex history. The manuscript, as it was originally conceived, was commissioned in France by John, the Duke of Berry, sometime around 1382, before it was subsequently abandoned for more than 20 years. In 1405, it was picked up by new artists, which included the famous Limburg brothers. The manuscript was still incomplete in 1413 when the Duke decided to present it to a lord in his court, in exchange for yet another Book of Hours. From there, the manuscript went through at least 2 other patrons and ultimately as many as 7 sets of artists. Among the artists attributed with working on the manuscript is the famous Flemish painter, John van Eyck. The manuscript was ultimately dismembered. A portion of it ended up in Milan, another in Turin, and still another in Paris, with other parts scattered elsewhere. But thanks to the work of scholars who managed to associate the Milan manuscript with that of Turin, the two were united, and it is this portion that has been duplicated here in facsimile form. From the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the Codex went through a series of interesting experimentation with regards to its structure. One of those experiments was called the Girdle Book. The Girdle Book is a book whose block is stitched to a piece of oversized leather with soft flaps that can be looped over one's belt, a style that was very popular among traveling monks and pilgrims. Devotional books, or professional reference books, were most often bound in this manner. Some of the bindings were even produced in velvet to protect a more elegant illuminated prayer book. This girdle book was produced sometime around 1330 in the south of France. In it, the author describes an eyewitness account of St. Dominic at prayer. Written in great detail, the book includes 9 miniatures which show St. Dominic in various attitudes of prayer, emphasizing the use of the whole body while crying, laughing, and otherwise outwardly exclaiming. But while St. Dominic was praying out loud, reading was becoming more and more a silent act. Legible text, spaces between words, standardized punctuation were all newly developed features that guided the individual reader. Coupled with mechanization, this shift took the emphasis away from the book as a physical object and focused instead on the content inside. By the 15th century, the demand for books solidified them as a commodity. But in order to keep up the supply chain, a new technology had to be developed. That technology was the printing press. The Gutenberg Bible was the first book printed from movable metal type. The typeface, designed by Johann Gutenberg himself, was based on a medieval script used for liturgical works in Western Germany. It was called Textura. The typecast consisted of nearly 300 characters, including variant forms of letters, ligatures, and abbreviations to simulate as much as possible manuscript conventions. The process was miserable and tedious, but once the page was set, you could print hundreds and even thousands of copies. Imagine having to handwrite that many books. With movable type, letters could be rearranged countless times to produce an infinite variety of texts. Plus, they could be combined with woodblock designs to print word and image together on the page. Printing the Bible was certainly a good business decision. All copies, approximately 180, had sold before they were off the press. Of those, 135 were printed on paper, and the rest on vellum. The development of the printing press seems like it could be the pinnacle of the book's evolution. But it's important to note that different technologies of the book did exist side by side and throughout its history. The clay tablet and the papyrus scroll, the scroll and the codex, manuscripts and printed books. Even today, we are given the option between paperbacks and ebooks. But out of all the forms, the codex is the one which we are most familiar with. Perhaps too familiar, for we no longer sense the hand which made the book possible. For nostalgic readers, there is still an aura to the book, but the everyday reader needs to be reminded that the book has a body, and to know it, one has to understand the language of anatomy. The codex form begins with the book block, the stack of pages we find between the covers. The book block is attached to the covers by end sheets, which include a flyleaf and a paste down. Between the two, a joint gives flexibility when it opens. On the other side, a rigid spine runs from head to foot. A decorative headband reinforces the binding, which can be stitched or glued. The headband allows the book to curve away from the rigid spine when it's open. Early on, books were displayed on shelves with the spines facing inward and the foredge facing out. Because of this, the foredge might be embellished with carved designs, gold leaf, or even intricate paintings. It wasn't until the mid-16th century that libraries and private book collectors began showcasing their bindings, leading to the addition of the author's name and the book's title to the spine of the book. Like the labeled spine, the title page is another feature of the codex that we often take for granted. We have come to expect that, upon opening the book, the title page would be the door through which we enter. But this wasn't always the case. The title page was first introduced sometime around the late 15th century, though its name can be traced back to a much earlier time. The word title comes from the Latin titulus, a term that was used to refer to the tag attached to a scroll which identified its contents. As for the codex, any information about the place or the manner of the book's production, if it was provided, would be found at the end of the book, in the colophon. The very first book to foreground the details of its content and publication was a 1476 printing of Calendarium by Johann Müller, or Regiomontanus for short. It included a promotional ad, the date, and the names of its three printers, Rotdolt, Loslane, and Pictor. The first edition of Calendarium was printed in 1474 at Regiomontanus' own press in Nuremberg. In 1476, master printer Erhard Rotdolt published it in Venice, the capital of Italian printing, followed by this edition in 1482. Calendarium represents the first application of modern scientific methods. It includes astronomical calculations, observations of the lunar calendar, the accurate prediction of eclipses, and so much more. This edition was not only technically innovative, but artistically elegant as well. Still following the manuscript tradition, the opening pages of books were often elaborate and sometimes included what is called a frontispiece. The term has its origins in 16th century architecture, referring to a building's decorative facade. The frontispiece was pretty, but it also served a function. Extra copies of the page would be printed as an advertisement and distributed to boost sales. Another way printers began to expand their readership was by printing books in the vernacular, meaning the language of the people. The Protestant Reformation also helped them move away from Latin language books by advocating for a more direct relationship between the individual and God. Martin Luther's Bible, printed in 1522, provided a German translation intended for wider audience of lay readers. Shortly after, other religious texts were printed entirely in German, like this book here. Leonard Kaiser was a student in Wittenberg, spreading Martin Luther's message through letters and books he sent to friends. In 1527, he was arrested, imprisoned, and interrogated for openly preaching Lutheran doctrine. While Kaiser was in prison, Martin Luther sent him a letter of consolation, but he had already been burned at the stake. This volume, published a year later, includes that letter to Kaiser. Kaiser's execution in Bavaria on August 16, 1527, quickly became infamous, and this text was reprinted 9 times in quick succession. The first 100 years of the printed codex marked an important technological shift, the mechanical reproduction of text. But it also established a philosophical shift in terms of how we relate to books. By the 17th century, the structure of the book had evolved specifically to cater to a sense of intimacy and cultural value. Authors, publishers, and booksellers began to court the reader through newly developed features included in the book. Prefaces, illustrations, foldouts, and volvelles are just a few of such features which actively engage with the reader in a tactile way, treating the page as a space for personal exploration. And in order to explore, the reader was also given certain navigational aids, a table of contents, page numbers, running heads, and indices, things that are so commonplace today we barely notice them. While these features helped market the book as a commodity, they inadvertently changed the way that we read. Readers were no longer simply absorbing the text, but they were now engaging with it, consuming it, reframing it. Readers were becoming a part of the adventure. One adventure, so fantastic it was long considered to be a work of fiction, is John Cockburn's tale, A Journey Over Land. The story begins with Cockburn and his crew being overtaken off the coast of Jamaica by another ship in the year 1730. The survivors escaped from jail in Honduras and crossed the isthmus to San Salvador, traveling to Panama overland. A fold-out map depicts the region. Because of the book's popularity, A Journey Overland was reprinted several different times. The more popular a book is, the longer its life will be, outliving the author by centuries, and sometimes millennia. Think about it. We are still reading the works of authors like Virgil and Homer to this day. What is the most popular book? In terms of sales, the Bible has been sold more times than any other book in history. A Tale of Two Cities, The Little Prince, and Harry Potter rank in the top 5, with more than 100 million copies sold each. But beyond an individual title, there is a book, well, a set of books, that has become a mainstay in the modern home, decorating our shelves since the mid-18th century. That book is the Encyclopedia. The first of its kind, Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie, was published in 1751. And it wasn't just a book, it was an entire business, staffing thousands of people from paper makers, printers, and binders to the greatest minds of the French Enlightenment, including Diderot himself. Diderot wanted to give the masses the most up-to-date resources on philosophy, science, mathematics, and culture in order to change the common way of thinking. And in many ways, he did just that. In order to fill the pages of the encyclopedia, Diderot enlisted the help of the finest thinkers of the 18th century, with some of the most notable contributions coming from the likes of Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and D'Alembert. Far from being a neutral compendium of useful knowledge, Diderot's encyclopedia was nothing short of a political manifesto, an attempt on the part of the radical French intellectuals to establish their own authority by virtue of superior reason. By 1759, 7 volumes had been completed and published. All were banned by the French government and subsequently placed on the index by the Pope. But Diderot carried on, and over the course of 20 years finished 28 volumes in total, comprised of more than 71,000 articles and over 3,000 illustrations. The encyclopedia was finally complete in 1772, selling almost 25,000 copies across Europe. It is hard to imagine that such a substantial work was an underground publication, but that's exactly what it was. The encyclopedia celebrates an idea of knowledge and learning that has become a dominant characteristic of our modern age and remains a prominent aspect of our lives. But now, we just call it something different.
Using the encyclopedia as an example, it's easy to see how our conception of the book as an access point to information can be influenced by the shape that it takes. There are a number of different factors that might determine the size and shape of a book. Some are purely logistical, while others might be economical. Then there are the factors which are symbolic. Either way, we have become accustomed to small books, to paperbacks, but the concept of the paperback is still fairly new. By the late 19th century, industrialization brought the steam-driven press, the steam-powered paper-making machine, mechanical typecasting and setting, as well as machine-made case bindings. All of this made printing books cheaper and faster, allowing them to be made in greater quantities and at reduced prices. As the economy shifted toward cheap labor and cheap materials, authors began to receive a living wage for their work. Writing became a profession, and with it, a class of novelists and poets presented publishers with a consistent stream of material to print. The book market was booming, and as such, publishers saw a unique financial opportunity. Seeking to maximize their profits, publishers realized they could print the same book in different forms, in different sizes, and for different audiences. Longer books could first be serialized in journals or as pamphlets, later bound for libraries, and then finally sold as cheap reprints for a mass audience. Charles Dickens' first novel, The Pickwick Papers, was published in such a way. The Pickwick Papers were published in monthly editions, with Dickens supplying new installments as needed. The humorous tale was so successful that the print run had to be increased from 400 to 40,000 by the 15th installment. From March 1836 to November 1837, 19 issues were produced, with the last being double the length and at a cost of 2 shillings. By the end of the year, the novel was introduced to the public in book format by publisher Chapman and Hall. In an essay titled The New Art of Making Books, Ulysses Carry-On writes, "A book is a sequence of spaces. Each of these spaces is perceived at a different moment. A book is also a sequence of moments. A book is not a case of words, nor a bag of words, nor a bearer of words. A book is a space-time sequence." One way to explore that space-time sequence is through the tunnel binding style, also known as the peep show. The tunnel book was a form that first originated during the Italian Renaissance, based on the optical experiments of artist Leon Battista Alberti. This book is an example of an early 19th century peep show, depicting the Promenade de Longchamp in Paris. The book is etched on the front and back panes and contains 4 cutout sections in between, all hand-colored. The front panel has a circular viewing aperture. The Promenade de Longchamp was an annual social event which took place on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of Holy Week every spring. The tour ended at the Abbey of Longchamp, a village 4 miles from Paris, where the nuns would sing the Tenebrae. A convent there, established in 1256, had long been a destination for religious pilgrims. But in the late 17th century, the pilgrimage became an unauthorized secular spectacle. The nuns' choir was fortified with singers from the Paris Opera. The theater in Paris was closed during Lent, which made the promenade one of the few ways in which high society could flaunt their new spring fashions. Processions of people in festive costume traveled on horseback, in carriages, and on foot. Wealthy citizens of Paris vied to have the most elaborate carriages and clothing, while the lower classes, including laborers, soldiers, and prostitutes, lined the route to Gacques. Police turned out in force to keep the parade participants safe. The Paris Archbishop de Beaumont tried to halt the parade by ordering the convent closed during Holy Week. The parade did not stop. Participants were there to see and to be seen. In 1789, the promenade was disrupted by an angry mob. The convent, by then wholly peripheral to the show, was closed by the revolutionary government. Napoleon revived the parade in the 19th century, in part as a way to bolster the fashion industry. But the later parades did not match the lush grandeur of those in the 18th century. Still, the parade contributed to later fashion phenomenon. The American Easter Parade and the big, ostentatious hats of the Kentucky Derby can be traced back to this French tradition. The mass-produced books of the 19th century were in part a response to the Industrial Revolution. Mechanization turned book production into an enterprise, leaving very little room for creativity and experimentation. The 20th century had a different response. There was to be a new class of books, artist books. The term artist book is flexible, to say the least, but regardless of definitions, one thing all artist books have in common is their ability to interrogate our idea of the codex. They make us question how we read by drawing attention to every aspect of their structure, form, and content as a way to make meaning. The futurists of the 20th century gave us some of the earliest examples of artist books. In the newly established Soviet Union, futurists, constructivists, supremacists all worked collectively to provide society new perspectives by breaking in the physical, visual, cultural, and aesthetic orthodoxies which had long governed the old way of life. Book architect L. Lissitzky focused on spatial relations. Lissitzky had a certain philosophy when it came to book construction. He wanted to introduce the book to the reader as a dynamic object, such that it can be turned and manipulated in addition to being read. Lissitzky saw beauty in industry, technology, mass production, and repetition. He was inspired by the modern world and experimented with pieces of type to develop abstract forms that can be read simultaneously as pictures, symbols, sounds, and words. Although Lissitzky's architecture of the book was unique, it certainly did not exist in a vacuum. In fact, much of his inspiration was drawn from the atmosphere of Berlin. And it was in Berlin where Vladimir Mayakovsky and Lissitzky met and began collaborating on Для голоса. Для голоса, or For the Voice, it's considered one of the most innovative works of the early 20th century. With its distinct typographic style inspired by the concept of new optics, this book finds a direct path to the brain through the eye rather than the ear. As noted by Lissitzky, in this channel, the waves rush with much greater speed and pressure than the acoustic channel. One can speak out only through the mouth, but the book's facilities for expression take many more forms. For Mayakovsky, it was important that his poems be read aloud, hence the title. Lissitzky responded by replacing a table of contents with a thumb index to make the poems easier to find. In addition to the book's experimental architecture, Mayakovsky's best known and most frequently performed poems are transformed into an energetic visual representation using color and typography. It might seem counterintuitive, contradictory even, that I'm going on and on about the material form of the book while displaying images through a digital platform. On the one hand, it gives us a chance to think about and savor the physical artifact. On the other, it's a testament of how different forms can coexist simultaneously, like they have for thousands of years. So then, are the rumors true? Are we about to witness the death of the book? The codex form has been on the endangered list since the advent of radio, then television, and now computers and the internet. The book is surely poised to disintegrate into the digital realm. On top of all of that, libraries all over the country have refocused spending to create better study spaces, provide access to technology, and facilitate meetings and events. In order to do so, stacks get hidden away, books get deaccessioned, sold, and in some cases, simply thrown out. But if we've learned anything over the course of this video, it is to never assume the authority, materiality, or permanence of a text. And while it may seem that digital books would have a longer shelf life than printed books, the pace of technological development virtually ensures the obsolescence of ebooks tied to a specific platform or software. Thus, ephemerality is a concern shared by both physical and digital books. So the Codex lives on, for now, because despite its vulnerability to fire, bookworms, water, and the sun, it is the most accommodating medium we've seen thus far. It requires no electricity, no software updates, no wires or plugs. You can drop it, you can write in it, you can even use it to balance out your furniture. It can withstand changes in temperature, and if stored properly, it will continue to remain accessible for decades, even centuries. Yes, it is a physical object, but it is also the idea that we have of a bound text, an idea that is informed by what we read, how we read, where we read, and why we read. To learn more about the history of the book and its form, check out The Book by Amaranth Barsuk, available in the general collection of the Marriott Library. If you have any questions about the books in this presentation or about any of the books in our collection, feel free to send us an email or check us out on our website, lib.utah.edu/collections/rarebooks.